The mountains of Colorado do not possess a conscience. They are vast, indifferent cathedrals of granite and pine that have watched civilizations crumble into the dirt without blinking an eye. When you walk into the Comanche Peak wilderness, you are entering a space where the rules of the civilized world are stripped away like dead bark from a cedar. The air up there at 8,000 feet is thin and sharp, tasting of ozone and ancient stone. It is a place where silence is not the absence of sound, but a heavy physical presence that sits on your chest and waits for you to make a mistake. I have spent a lifetime looking at maps of these regions, tracing the lines where people simply cease to exist, and every time the same cold shiver settles in the marrow of my bones. October 2nd, 1999, was a day that should have been defined by the smell of wood smoke and the golden hue of turning aspens. Jaryd Atadero was a man who understood the risks of the wild, but he also believed in the restorative power of the trail. He brought his 2 children to the Big Thompson Canyon for a weekend that was supposed to be about fellowship and the simple joy of a crisp autumn hike. They were part of a group of 11 adults, a gathering of Christian singles looking for peace in the shadows of the peaks. Among them was Jaryd Atadero, a 3-year-old boy with a mop of hair and a spirit that couldn't be contained by the narrow gravel paths. He was a pocket of kinetic energy in a world of static rock. Jaryd was wearing a tan pullover blue warm-up pants and a pair of white sneakers that looked too clean for the rugged terrain. He was a child who lived in the moment, oblivious to the fact that the wilderness is a predatory thing that watches from the periphery. The group began their ascent toward the meadows, the sound of their boots crunching on the dry needles providing a rhythmic soundtrack to their chatter. Jaryd was darting back and forth, playing the games that children play when they feel safe in the presence of adults. He was never more than a few yards away, a small figure in a sea of giants. The sun was high, casting long, sharp shadows through the timber, and the wind was a low moan through the upper branches. There is a specific point on the trail where the topography shifts, where the slope becomes a bit steeper and the trees huddle closer together. Jaryd had run ahead of the main group, catching up with 2 hikers who were about 50 yards in front of the others. These 2 individuals saw the boy, spoke to him briefly, and watched as he turned to run back toward his father. It was a span of perhaps 50 feet of trail, a distance that a grown man could cover in a dozen strides. The 2 hikers assumed he reached the group, and the group assumed he was still with the hikers. In that narrow gap of time and space, Jaryd Atadero walked into a fold in reality and never walked out. When Alan realized his son wasn't with the forward hikers, the air in the canyon seemed to turn to liquid lead. The calling started as a firm command, "Jaryd, get back here," but within minutes, it devolved into a jagged primal scream that echoed off the canyon walls. The group scrambled, checking behind boulders and beneath the low-hanging boughs of Douglas firs. There was no response. No crying, no sound of a child tripping over a root, no rustle of fabric against the brush. The forest had simply closed its mouth. It is a terrifying realization when you understand that a human being can vanish in the time it takes to draw a single breath. By the time the sun began to dip behind the jagged teeth of the Mummy Range, the search had begun in earnest. Search and rescue teams arrived with a sense of grim purpose, bringing with them the technology of the modern world to combat the ancient mystery of the woods. They brought in helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared cameras, machines capable of detecting the heat signature of a rabbit from hundreds of feet in the air. They scanned the slopes, the meadows, and the dark recesses of the timber. The thermal units found nothing but the cold, radiating heat of the rocks and the occasional elk moving through the shadows. The boy was gone, and the mountain was giving up no secrets. The bloodhounds were brought in next, those long-eared investigators that live in a world of scent. They were given a piece of Jaryd's clothing, a scent memory of a little boy who liked to run. The dogs took the scent at the last known location, their noses pressed hard against the earth, tails flagging with excitement. They followed the trail for a short distance along the path, but then they reached a specific spot and stopped. They didn't lose the scent because of wind or water. They began to circle, frantically, whining and looking up into the air. To the handlers, it looked as if the trail simply terminated in the middle of the dirt. As if Jaryd had been plucked from the earth by an invisible hand. The weather, as it often does in these cases, took a turn for the worse. A brutal storm rolled over the peaks, dumping snow and freezing rain onto the searchers. The temperature plummeted to well below freezing, turning the search area into a landscape of white crystalline silence. For 8 days, over 500 people combed every square inch of that mountain. They crawled through thickets, rappelled down rock faces, and waded through the icy waters of the Big Thompson River. They found nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a footprint in the mud, not a single hair. It was as if Jaryd Atadero had never existed at all. For 4 years, Jaryd Atadero lived in a purgatory of unanswered questions. He faced the whispers of the suspicious and the crushing weight of his own grief. He returned to the mountain time and time again, walking the same trails, shouting the same name into the wind. The theory of a mountain lion was often floated by the authorities. They claimed a big cat could have snatched the boy and vanished without a trace. But those who know the woods know that mountain lions are messy eaters. They leave tracks, they leave blood, and they leave remains. There was no blood on that trail. There was no sign of a struggle. There was only the silence. Then in June of 2003, the mountain finally decided to vomit up a piece of the truth. 2 hikers, Rob and Stacy, were trekking off trail nearly 2,000 feet above the location where Jaryd had vanished. They were in a rugged, inaccessible area known as a vertical chimney, a place where the terrain is so steep it requires hands and feet to navigate. It is a location that no 3-year-old boy could have reached on his own, especially not in the minutes following his disappearance. It was there among the jagged rocks and the thin mountain air that they saw something that didn't belong. Propped against a log as if placed there with intent was a single tooth. Nearby they found a small fragment of a skull. And then they found the clothes. The tan pullover and the blue warm-up pants were there, but they weren't shredded by the teeth of a predator. They were in remarkably good condition, though the colors had faded under the relentless high-altitude sun. The most chilling detail was the shoes. Jaryd's white sneakers were sitting there, the laces still tied. The interiors clean of any biological material. They looked as if someone had carefully removed them from the boy's feet and set them down in the dirt. The pants were found inside out. This is a recurring detail in these disappearances that defies any easy explanation. When a predator kills, it does not undress its prey. When a child dies of exposure, they sometimes engage in paradoxical undressing, but they do not turn their clothes inside out and tuck them away. The location of the remains was the biggest impossibility. To reach that spot, Jaryd would have had to climb a vertical gain of 2,000 feet through some of the most treacherous terrain in the park. He would have had to do it in the middle of a mountain storm without leaving a single trace for the dogs or the infrared cameras to find. I have sat in darkened rooms and looked at the photos of that site. The way the skull fragment was bleached white, the way the single tooth sat alone on the forest floor. It felt like a macabre display, a mocking gesture from whatever entity inhabits the high places. There are those who suggest that a bird of prey, a massive eagle perhaps, could have carried the boy up there. But an eagle cannot turn a pair of pants inside out. An eagle cannot untie or carefully remove a pair of sneakers. The physical evidence points to a deliberate, intelligent intervention, one that does not conform to the laws of biology as we understand them. The investigators were left with a puzzle that had no edges. They analyzed the skull fragment and confirmed through DNA that it was indeed Jaryd. They looked for signs of animal gnawing, and while there was some evidence of scavenging, it didn't explain the initial event. The lack of blood at the disappearance site, the failure of the dogs, and the impossible height at which the remains were found created a narrative that felt more like a ghost story than a police report. Something had taken. That boy moved him through the woods like a shadow and deposited his remains years later in a place designed to be found only by the most determined of explorers. I often think about the silence Jaryd must have experienced in those final moments. Was he afraid, or was he in a state of trance, led away by something that hummed in a frequency only he could hear? There are reports in these areas of strange lights, of sudden drops in temperature, and of a feeling of being watched by eyes that do not blink. We like to think we are the masters of our domain. But the story of Jaryd Atadero reminds us that we are merely guests in a house that has many rooms we are not permitted to enter. The mountain took a child and gave back a handful of bone and some faded fabric, offering no apology and no explanation. The case remains a wound that will not heal. Jaryd Atadero still speaks of his son, his voice carrying the weary cadence of a man who has looked into the abyss and saw it looking back. He knows that the official version of events, the mountain lion theory, is a convenient lie told to keep the tourists coming to the parks. It is easier to blame a cat than to admit that there are things in the wilderness that can bypass our technology, our senses, and our understanding of physics. We are surrounded by a world that is much older and much hungrier than we dare to imagine. The pattern is what haunts me the most. The way these cases mirror one another across decades and across continents. The shoes found miles from the last point of contact, the clothes turned inside out, the impossible terrain, and the sudden violent shifts in weather. It is a formula for a nightmare that repeats with terrifying precision. We see it in the high Sierras, in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, and in the jagged peaks of the Rockies. It is a phenomenon that targets the young and the old, the vulnerable and the fit, leaving behind only questions that have no answers. Consider the case of Bobby Bizup in 1958. A 10-year-old boy who went missing from a camp in the Rocky Mountain National Park not far from where Jaryd would vanish decades later. Bobby was hearing impaired and vanished while walking a short distance between a mess hall and his cabin. Despite a massive search, nothing was found until a year later. His remains were discovered high up on a steep, rocky ridge that searchers had already cleared. His clothing was found in a similar state of impossible placement, and the location was one that a boy with his physical limitations could never have reached on his own. Then there is the disappearance of young Maurice Dametz in the top of the world area of Colorado in 1981. A man who was an experienced mineral hunter, vanishing while his friend turned his back for only a moment. Like Jaryd, Maurice was in a location where he should have been easily found. Like Jaryd, the dogs couldn't find a scent. The mountains of Colorado are beautiful, yes, but they are also a graveyard for those who do not realize that the shadow of a tree is sometimes more than just a lack of light. We walk the trails and we tell ourselves we are safe because we have GPS and cell phones and sturdy boots. But Jaryd Atadero had people watching him. He had a father who loved him. He had a group of adults just yards away. And yet the mountain reached out and took him anyway. It took him, and it kept him for 4 years before placing him on a high ledge like a trophy. As you sit in the safety of your home listening to the wind rattle the window panes, just remember that out there, in the dark, timber, and the high granite, the rules are different. And the mountain is always, always patient. The office is quiet tonight. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air right before a massive storm breaks over the divide. My desk is buried under a mountain of reports, faded photographs and topographical maps that have been folded and unfolded so many times they are tearing at the seams. You look at these pages long enough and the lines start to look like veins, like the geography itself is alive and pulsing with a slow, cold heart. People ask me why I keep doing this. Why I keep staring into the black hole of these disappearances when there are no easy answers to be found. It is because the silence of the woods is not empty. It is filled with the echoes of people who walked into the trees and simply ceased to exist. We tell ourselves stories to stay sane, to make the world feel small and manageable, but the truth is a jagged thing that does not care about our comfort. On a crisp morning in October of 1999, the air in the Poudre Canyon was sharp enough to cut. Jaryd Atadero was only 3 years old, a burst of energy in a blue jacket and tiny sneakers walking a trail he should have been safe on. He was surrounded by adults, a group of Christian singles who were more interested in the scenery and the fellowship than the shifting shadows between the ponderosa pines. The trail was the Big South, a path that hugs the river and winds through some of the most rugged terrain in the Roosevelt National Forest. Jaryd was running ahead, then falling back, playing the games that children play when they think the world is a playground built just for them. He ran around a bend in the trail just a few dozen feet ahead of the group, and in the space of a single breath he was gone. There was no scream. No sound of a struggle, no snapping of branches, or the frantic scuffle of a predator attacking its prey. There was only the sudden, suffocating absence of a child who had been there 1 second and vanished the next. The group searched the immediate area, calling his name, their voices bouncing off the granite walls of the canyon and returning to them hollow and mocking. They expected to see him peeking out from behind a boulder or sitting by the water, but the trail was empty. The river was high and churning with white water, but there was no sign that anyone had slipped or fallen. It was as if the mountain had simply opened its mouth and swallowed him whole, leaving behind nothing but the scent of pine and the distant, indifferent roar of the Cache la Poudre River. The search that followed was one of the most intensive in the history of the state of Colorado. Hundreds of volunteers, professional trackers, and specialized mountain rescue teams combed every square inch of that canyon. They brought in bloodhounds, animals trained to catch a scent that a human could never detect, but the dogs were useless. They would sniff the ground circle in confusion, and then simply sit down, refusing to track. It was as if Jaryd's scent had been erased from the earth, scrubbed away by some force that the dogs understood better than the men holding their leashes. The weather turned sour, as it often does in these cases, with a sudden drop in temperature and a dusting of snow that hampered the searchers and turned the terrain into a slick, treacherous nightmare. 4 years passed. 4 years of agonizing silence for Alan Atadero, Jaryd's father. Then in 2003, 2 hikers were exploring a steep, rocky ridge high above the trail where Jaryd had vanished. They were far off the beaten path, in an area that searchers had supposedly cleared multiple times during the initial investigation. There, on a narrow ledge that required a technical climb to reach, they found a single tooth and a scrap of blue fabric. It was Jaryd's jacket, turned inside out. Nearby, they found his tiny sneakers sitting side by side on the rock, looking as if they had been placed there with deliberate, terrifying care. The shoes were in remarkably good condition, the rubber soles still showing the fine texture of the tread despite 4 years of exposure to the brutal Colorado elements. The official version of events was quickly polished and presented to the public. A mountain lion had taken the boy. They pointed to the tooth and the scattered remains as evidence of a predatory attack. But if you look closer, the theory falls apart like wet paper. A mountain lion is a messy eater, and it does not carefully remove a child's shoes and set them neatly on a ledge. It does not turn a jacket inside out before dragging its prey up a vertical cliff face that would challenge a professional mountaineer. And the most disturbing detail of all. The clothing showed no signs of the violent tearing or the blood soaking that would accompany a mauling. It was as if Jaryd had been lifted out of his clothes and transported to that high, lonely place by something that defied the laws of biology and physics. Looking back at the Atadero case, you start to see the jagged edges of a much larger puzzle. It is easier for the Park Service to blame a cat than to admit that there are things in the wilderness that can bypass our technology and our senses. We are surrounded by a world that is much older and much hungrier than we dare to imagine. The pattern is what haunts me the most. The way these cases mirror one another across decades and across continents. The shoes found miles from the last point of contact, the clothes turned inside out, the impossible terrain, and the sudden violent shifts in weather. It is a formula for a nightmare that repeats with terrifying precision, leaving behind a trail of broken families and unanswered questions. Consider the case of Bobby Bizup in 1958. He was a 10-year-old boy, hearing impaired and full of a quiet wonder for the world around him. He was at a summer camp in the Rocky Mountain National Park, a place called Camp St. Malo, tucked away beneath the towering shadow of Long's Peak. Bobby was walking a short distance between the mess hall and his cabin, a path he had walked dozens of times before. It was a clear day, and there were other children and counselors within earshot. One moment he was walking along the gravel path, and the next he was gone. The silence that followed was not just the silence of a boy who could not hear. It was the silence of a forest that had suddenly become a void. The search for Bobby was massive, involving hundreds of people and military personnel who scoured the area for any sign of the boy. They looked in the creek, they looked in the dense timber, and they looked in every crawl space of the camp. Nothing. It wasn't until a year later that a searcher found his remains. They were located high up on a steep rocky ridge over 2,000 feet above the camp. This was an area that had been searched by air and by foot multiple times. The terrain was so rugged and steep that a 10-year-old boy with physical limitations could never have reached it on his own, especially not in the short window of time before the search began. His hearing aid was found lying on a rock, and his clothing was found in a state that mirrored the Atadero case. Placed in a way that suggested a deliberate hand rather than a random animal attack. In 1981, the mountains of Colorado claimed another victim in a way that defies all logic. Maurice Dametz was an experienced mineral hunter, a man who knew the high country and understood the risks of the terrain. He was in an area known as the Top of the World, near the town of Florissant, searching for crystals with a friend. The two men were only yards apart. Maurice's friend turned his back for just a moment to put some tools in the truck. When he turned back, Maurice was gone. There were no tracks in the soft soil, no sound of a struggle, and no place for a grown man to hide in the sparse high-altitude vegetation. Maurice was 74 years old and walked with a cane. He wasn't going to run away, and he certainly wasn't going to disappear into thin air. The search for Maurice Dametz was exhaustive, but it turned up absolutely nothing. No cane, no hat, no scrap of clothing. The dogs were brought in, and once again they failed to find a single trace of scent. It was as if Maurice had been plucked from the surface of the earth by a giant hand. The Top of the World is a place of strange energy where the granite is rich with quartz, and the air feels thin and electric. Some people talk about portals, come about ripples in the fabric of reality that open and close like a camera shutter. Others talk about something more physical, a predator that moves in the spaces between our perceptions. Whatever it was, it took Maurice Dametz and never gave him back. When you spend enough time looking at these maps, you start to see the clusters. There are spots on the earth where the veil seems thinner, where people go missing at a rate that defies statistical probability. These spots are almost always near high concentrations of granite near water, and often in areas where boulder fields and dense timber create a labyrinth of shadows. The weather in these cases is almost a character itself. A sudden fog, a localized storm that appears out of nowhere to wash away tracks and hide the evidence. It is as if the mountain is aware of the intrusion and is actively working to conceal what it has taken. I think about the Glimmer Man phenomenon, the reports of a translucent shimmering distortion in the air that people see right before something goes wrong. It is a microscopic observation of the atmosphere, a bending of light that suggests something is standing right in front of you, invisible but very much there. Is it possible that Jaryd Atadero saw a shimmer in the pines before he ran toward it? Did Bobby Bizup feel a change in the air pressure, a sudden heaviness in his chest, before he was lifted toward the ridge? We rely on our eyes and our ears to tell us what is real, but our senses are limited to a very narrow frequency. The wilderness operates on a much broader, much more predatory spectrum. The official agencies will always have an explanation. They will tell you it was a bear or a lion or a tragic accident involving a fall and hypothermia. They will tell you that the searchers simply missed the body, even when the body is found in an area they walked over a dozen times. They have to tell you these things because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. If they admit that people are being taken by something they can't track and can't explain, the national parks would empty overnight. The tourism industry would collapse and the illusion of our dominance over nature would be shattered. So they keep the secrets buried in the files and they let the families wonder why their loved ones' shoes were found pristine on a ledge 2 miles high. I remember the feeling of walking into the deep timber of the Rockies at dusk. The way the light turns a bruised purple and the shadows of the trees stretch out like long, thin fingers. You feel a prickle on the back of your neck, a sense of being watched by something that isn't using eyes to see you. It is a primal fear, one that we have tried to drown out with the hum of our electronics and the glare of our flashlights. But out there, miles from the nearest paved road, those things don't matter. Your GPS can fail, your radio can turn to static, and your sturdy boots won't help you if the ground beneath them isn't as solid as you think it is. The case of Jaryd Atadero is not an isolated incident. It is a single stitch in a vast, dark fabric that stretches across the globe. We see it in the high Sierras, where hikers vanish from well-marked trails. We see it in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the trees are so thick they seem to breathe. We see it in the jagged peaks of the Rockies, where the granite holds the secrets of the dead. It is a phenomenon that targets the young and the old, the vulnerable and the fit, leaving behind only questions that have no answers. The mountain is patient, and it has all the time in the world to wait for the next person to step off the trail and into the unknown. As you sit in the safety of your home listening to the wind rattle the window panes, just remember that out there in the dark timber and the high granite, the rules are different. The mountain does not care about your plans or your technology. It is a graveyard for those who do not realize that the shadow of a tree is sometimes more than just a lack of light. Jaryd Atadero had people watching him. He had a father who loved him. He had a group of adults just yards away. And yet, the mountain reached out and took him anyway. It took him, and it kept him for 4 years before placing him on a high ledge like a trophy, a grim reminder of who really owns the wild. There is a case from 1938 that still chills me to the bone. Young Keith Parkins vanished from his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon. He was only 2 years old. He went outside to play and was gone in a heartbeat. The searchers found him 20 hours later, nearly 12 miles away from the ranch. To get there, the boy would have had to cross multiple barbed wire fences, navigate through dense brush, and climb over a mountain range in the middle of a freezing night. He was found face down in the snow, alive but in a state of deep shock. When he was asked how he got there, he couldn't explain it. A 2-year-old cannot walk 12 miles through a mountain range in 20 hours. It is physically impossible. And then there is the more recent disappearance of Danny Philippidis in 2018. He was a seasonal firefighter, a man in peak physical condition who went missing from a ski resort in New York. 6 days later, he turned up in Sacramento, California. He was still wearing his ski gear, including his helmet and goggles. He had no memory of how he got there, but he had somehow traveled nearly 3,000 miles across the country in a state of total fugue. He had no identification, no money, and no vehicle. These cases suggest a manipulation of space and time that we are not prepared to understand, a folding of the map that allows something to move people across vast distances in the blink of an eye. The pattern remains unresolved, a jagged line of disappearances that continues to grow with each passing year. We look for answers in the dirt and the stone, but the truth is likely somewhere else in the spaces between the atoms, in the frequencies we cannot hear. Until we are willing to look at the impossible, we will continue to lose people to the silence of the woods. The mountain is always watching, and it is always, always patient. Sleep well tonight, but if you find yourself near the edge of the trees, don't look back. Because sometimes the things in the shadows are looking right back at you.